Welcome to the latest episode of the Coaching Lab. We are thrilled to have Dr. Daniel Brown with us, a leading expert and researcher on the psychology of human excellence and well-being, including the impact of mental health and the understanding of resilience and the ability to truly thrive in the full sense of the word. Whether you're a coach looking for new tools in your toolbox or a top performer seeking that extra edge, not just to perform, but to optimize your mental health in the process, this episode provides the answers. If you've been considering pursuing your MBHWSC approved coach certification as part of a new career pursuit, or maybe to give yourself a new tool in your toolbox as a physical therapist, occupational therapist, or other clinician, there are a few spots remaining for the cohort that kicks off in January, which includes all the latest updates from the MBHWSC and a complimentary study group for those pursuing the National Board exam. Details on our Institute site at catalystcoachinginstitute.com, or please, we're happy to chat with you anytime, answer your questions. Shoot us an email, results@catalystcoachinginstitute.com, and we can set up some time to talk through your specific situation, plans, how it fits into your career, all those kinds of things. And now, it's time to tap into the psychology of human excellence and well-being on the latest episode of the Coaching Lab podcast. Dr. Brown, it's great to have you here. We had to do a little scheduling manipulation to make this happen with you being out there in the UK and me here in Colorado, but really appreciate it with your busy schedule. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's kick it off. What recent research findings have you uncovered that you believe are really game changers in this field of health and performance? And we've been talking about both of those words throughout our conversation today, but let's just throw a few things out there and we'll see where this goes.
Yeah. Well, two things, I guess. You say about recent and also you say kind of game changer. What I'm going to say might sound really obvious, actually. I think for me, one of the big things that drives my work and one of the things that's really come through in our work is that we don't have to have either health, well-being, or performance.
Yes.
We can have both at the same time. Now, that seems obvious, right? But we needed to, through kind of the early work that we did over the last few years, one of the key points was sort of showing that could be the case. And so for me, whilst that might seem really obvious, actually it was a step that needed to kind of be talked about and shown. And so that has been kind of one of our big findings, our big revelations. And then I think probably this follow-on from that is how difficult it is to persuade people that you can do both things in sport at the same time. So often when we work with coaches, performance directors, the focus is still performance and trying to get well-being, mental health into that conversation. There's still a bit of resistance there. So they're probably the things that we're working with most at the moment.
Is there a qualifier to that? Because what you're saying, I love it. Agree with it. If our kids are all in their late 20s, one turns 30 this week. Wow. If they were involved in sport, that's what I would want as a parent. But we just hear story after story after story of the elite of the elite, the Tiger Woods, the Michael Jordans, the names that will live through history. Well-being was not a thing. They had struggle after struggle that seemed to drive them, that seemed to be that next level that took them from great performance, outstanding genetics, genius mindset to greatest of all time. Is there something about this approach is incredibly valuable for 99.999% of us? And yet,
yeah. So I guess, and I can't dispute those stories and those stories that people have, but I think we run the risk of almost having confirmation type bias when we look at those stories.
Survivor bias, yeah.
Okay? Yeah, survivor bias, confirmation bias, right? Because for every Michael Jordan or Tiger Woods that has existed through adversity, challenge, trauma, there's probably 99.9% of people who experience the same things who haven't made it. And so
yes,
whilst we can say that, yes, for these individuals, these things are true to their story, there are also many, many, many more people who experience similar things who didn't make it to that level. So by just focusing on those individuals who've had incredible feats within sport, but by just focusing on those individuals, we kind of lose, I think, that wider perspective on, and it maybe masks our lens in how we try to create sport environments for people.
So let's take it down a notch. I spent a lot of time in the triathlon and running world, and almost the same question at a lower level. The folks that are balanced, the folks that have good perspective, the folks that say, it'd be helpful to my family situation or my life or my school to take a rest day today, are very good and maybe have longer careers, but they're not the ones that are on the podium. The podium folks are those men or women who it is one track mind, it is dialed in, and it's not in the classic term of healthy or well-being related. So what are your thoughts with that? Are there windows of time where you say, yes, you can put everything aside for a 6-month period, a 2-year period, or no, Brad, long term, that's just that's a myth.
Yeah, I definitely fall into the camp of thinking about sustainable performance and long-term engagement and enjoyment of sport. So whilst there might be times within a cycle where other distractions maybe would be the term that people might use, they might want to block out or to move aside. I very much come from the position of sustainable engagement and performance in sport. And I think if people have those periods of time where they block everything out, but they do that for prolonged periods, then I don't think that's going to lead to sustainable success, sustainable performance, but also no thriving. If they're not enjoying what they're doing, if they're not finding fulfillment in what they're doing. And I think that's often, again, we spoke earlier about the Jordans of this world, but you've also got plenty of examples of multiple medal-winning athletes who have achieved those performance outcomes and then the next day experience huge loss because where's their sense of direction? Where's their sense of purpose at that moment in time? And that in itself can almost then lead to a more unhealthy engagement because they're constantly striving for more and more. Is that the sort of space? Is that the sort of environment? Is that sort of the ethos that we want to drive within sport, within our performers? I wouldn't subscribe to that.
Yeah. Okay, so you led into my next question really well. You've done a lot of research on this concept of thriving. How do you define that term? It's kicked around. Kaiser Permanente uses it here in the U.S. for the core of their ad. We talk about it in the coaching lab a lot. How would you define it in sport or in life? And then what are some of the key aspects to actually making that a reality?
Yeah, so within sport, what we've found through our work is that athletes, practitioners, and coaching define or describe thriving as sustained high-level performance and an experience of well-being. And so when we're looking at athletes, they're the markers, they're the characteristics that we're looking for. Now, I make an important point there of sort of distinguishing in sport, because you're right to say that the term has been bandied around in kind of colloquial, common parlance as much as it has within the academic literature. And within the academic literature, if you were to go and read work on thriving at work, there's a huge body of work on thriving at work. They would see thriving differently. They would talk about it in terms of vitality and learning. And so when we're thinking about thriving, I think broadly, we define it as development and success. But as soon as you start to get into individual contexts, we need to think about what are meaningful markers of thriving in that setting. And And within sport, as I said, we look there at performance and we look at well-being at the same time. In terms of how do we bring it about and what are some of those factors, there are many, I think, which is a positive. I think where I'll probably focus is on my most recent work, where we've looked particularly at interpersonal relationships and the role that relationships and the environments that we exist within and the role that they play. Within our work, we've increasingly shown things like trust, openness, and understanding to be fundamental to people's relationships within sport contexts. And those relationships, the participants, the athletes, the performers are telling us are what's key and critical for their experience of thriving. So what we want to be, or the kind of the messaging from our work is we need to think about our environments. We need to think about the nature of the relationships within our environments and how they influence those individuals who kind of pass through or move within our spaces.
So if you got an athlete who, and I don't believe you do one-on-one coaching, but if you had someone come to you and say, or let's flip it. Let's say a coach comes to you and says, I need help with this athlete. Would your starting point be, well, what is your relationship with this individual? What is their relationship with their teammates? What is their relationship with spouse, partner, children, community? Like, how far out do we go with those concentric rings in terms of the at least initial focus?
Yeah, my first question to the coach would be, well, how well do you know this person? So I would probably strip out athlete and go to person first. I think when we're working with people, we should focus on the person before we focus on the athlete and focus on the performer. So I would ask them, how well do you know this person? How well do you know their values? How well do you know what's important to them? And how do they feel valued? I think they're probably the bedrock of the conversation. And if the coach can answer those questions, then we can then start to explore, okay, and then how's your relationship with that athlete? How do they interact with you? How do they interact with others? But first, I would want to know, what do they know about the person that they're wanting to work with?
It sounds to me like you were a consultant on the Ted Lasso show.
Ted Lasso has provided many great examples of that I can now draw on within my work, which is with certainly actually the work that we do with practitioners, with coaches, with performance directors. It's an amazing point of reference to talk to.
And yet it's so well loved. I am stunned the range of people that love that show. It's the folks that are super into athletics, and it's the folks that sports. I don't care about sports, but this guy's hilarious. And it's all the things that you're talking about. It's beautiful the way it's incredible. So it sounds like you weren't literally a consultant there, but you definitely pull some things in from that show when you're meeting with folks or doing presentations or as a reference point, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was not a consultant on the show. But
they need you. They need you. I think they're going to come calling after this interview.
It was definitely like a pinch me moment when I'm like, this is literally playing out how I would advocate.
Totally.
It was uncomfortable even. It was like, oh my word, is someone actually making a program about like high performance sport? Yes. All right, and the fictional team was going through their various ups and downs, but it was meant to be like a high performance team and a completely different approach to that. But I also think, and you're increasingly seeing examples of coaches who subscribe or seem to subscribe to that perspective of wanting to know more about their players and who they are. And I think, and these will be anecdotes rather than in evidence. And I guess my sport that I watch probably maybe the most, football, soccer, and you talk about examples of people like Jurgen Klopp or Pep Guardiola, and kind of a lot of what gets commented on is the relationships that they kind of make with their players. And what I think is really interesting is these relationships aren't just soft. They're not just cuddly. And taking this kind of what we would call a relational approach, okay, so trying to understand how we're connected to others isn't just about being soft and fuzzy all the time. It can still be about setting boundaries and setting expectations and holding people accountable, but it's doing so in a way which people feel valued and cared for. And I think when I listen to stories of players talking about Klopp or Guardiola or whatever, that, and Gareth Southgate, actually, when he was also in charge of the England football team, they were the stories, Fina Wiegman in the women's side, they were the stories that seemed to be coming through. And it seemed to be a real shift from perhaps what we'd heard before with more hard-nosed coaching, to use that type of phrase.
Yeah, it's interesting. The modeling seems so important. We're seeing that here in the U.S. in a big way with women's sports, with Title IX took so long to take effect. And now we're starting to see it. And my son, who's an incredibly focused NBA fan, has loved it. I think he enjoys the WNBA as much or more than the NBA because the women, their game is advanced so extraordinarily well over the last 5 to 6 years because of that opportunity, that modeling. They're seeing that in the real world. And it sounds like you're saying the same thing. The accepted approach, again, not soft and fuzzy, but the accepted approach is becoming what you're describing now in terms of the way coaches interact, in the way that players interact, in the way that they're treated by the press, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it's shifting. I don't think it's gone the whole cycle. And even I think we can probably identify examples of where it's kind of gone through that and it's now coming back again. And that is, I find, very interesting and not quite sure what to make of that. Like that fact that we've kind of gone from, right, we're moving away from this kind of super hard-nosed approach, militant, authoritarian approach, to maybe a more relational, more understanding-based approach. And yet we're starting to see examples of it kind of going back the other way. And I'm thinking, why is this happening? Like, why are we shifting back? And maybe the pressure to win continues to be so great that it's meaning that people are wanting to revert to old. That kind of dominant perspective was the dominant perspective for a very long time. So, that shift is really interesting to see that kind of start to move back a little bit. But I certainly think we hear a lot more positive stories about kind of coach-athlete relationships. We hear, as well as all of the issues that have existed, but there does seem to be this kind of movement. Also we're hearing a lot more athlete voice within all of this, and kind of hearing athlete voice. We talk often about younger athletes who used to having their voices heard. Now, certainly within the UK, they're used to being asked their opinion, and certainly talking to other practitioners, they see that coming through within their applied work. You mentioned earlier, you're right, I don't do much applied work. I do more sort of academic work and supporting practitioners. And so certainly talking to those practitioners, the athletes they're working with are different. They're fundamentally different because their views on their role in society is different. And coaches have to roll with that because if they don't, there'll be this disconnect and it won't work. So it's fascinating. It is fascinating to see what will happen next and just how it continues to evolve.
Well, and I think we see that in everything, economics, politics, et cetera. The pendulum swings. It swings back, but the top of the pendulum has been shifted to the side just a little bit. So when it does swing back, of course it swings back. That's how a pendulum works. But it doesn't come as far. And then it swings back and it shifts a little bit further. And I think from what I'm hearing, you're describing exactly that. It's, of course, coaches are going to come in and use some of their old school stuff. When things don't work, they're going to go back to what they learned for 40 years as a coach. And yet it seems to be moving. Let's step into the mental health side of things. We've seen with the Olympics recently, that was a huge focus. What what things have you picked up in terms of the relationship between mental health and athletic performance?
Yeah. So in terms of relationships, I think this kind of drove the focus of the work that we did, really, was recognizing that we had these athletes who were performing at their best or performing at the highest level, but their mental health seemed to be really poor, or their relationship with mental health seemed to be really poor. And I think we're still, as a field, trying to understand that. We know the prevalence of mental health problems or mental illness, depending on where you sit on diagnosis or not. That prevalence is equivalent or comparable in kind of these performance populations as they are in the wider population. So, but that doesn't surprise me, because these people are humans, these athletes are humans. So in the same way that someone in the general population would experience difficulties, so would somebody within a sport population. Of course, the pressures and the stresses that might influence those experiences are slightly different. But the fact that they are susceptible and experience challenges is the same. I think in terms of the relationship between, specifically the relationship between mental health and performance, our work focuses more on well-being. And again, this is where in the academic literature things get quite messy, because mental health is described as a state of well-being. So is it well-being or is it not? And not wanting to go down that rabbit hole right now. Right. I don't think that's one that's worthwhile. But so I think it depends. If we're talking about welfare, are we talking about mental health? Are we talking about well-being and how they kind of align with performance? So I don't think there's a straightforward answer there, and I'm not sure I've fully answered your question. But mental health exists within this population, within this space, as much as it does in any other spaces, I guess, is the way that I would look at it. And the way that I would understand mental health is through understanding how an individual is able to regulate themselves given what's going on around them. And how they regulate themselves is as much to do with their relationship with self as it is their relationship with others. Now, once we're in that space, and you can sort of see how my thoughts with mental health would align with my thoughts on performance and thriving, in that if it's about relationships and how we're connected, then it's all interwoven, I guess, together.
I've heard folks talk about drug of choice. For athletes, the drug of choice is another workout. The drug of choice is, I'm just going to focus on the competition. So we're using that, and certainly entrepreneurs, executives can fall into this as well, but we're using that as our drug of choice. So instead of alcohol, instead of whatever drug you use, we're stepping into one more event, one more workout, one more interval session to treat ourselves. And we don't call it that, but that's essentially what we're doing. Do you see any connection in that phraseology in terms of the way I'm describing it?
The thought that came to mind as you were describing that is chasing. People continually chasing that kind of next opportunity, that next thing. And for me, the thought then goes on to, well, how do we encourage people to accept where their current situation? How do we allow people to enjoy their current situation rather than feeling the need to continue to chase? Now, that's not to say that people shouldn't have goals and things that they want to achieve, but if it becomes, or almost becomes, this kind of unhealthy chasing, then there feels like there's a conversation around, okay, why is it you feel that you need to continue to chase? What is it that you're struggling with your own situation that means that you can't kind of enjoy, be present, accept that current kind of position? Yeah.
So that comment, I was just jotting a couple things down here. I hear this, and in some ways I kind of feel this. I don't want to make this Brad's confession time, but there's this thought of, yeah. I know it's not totally healthy, but it's what's gotten me to this point. I am where I am as an athlete or an executive or whatever because I do things this way. And yes, I would love to let the foot off the gas. I would love to be balanced and take, whatever. But I can't because I like who I ended up being. And I'm sure that this dysfunctional action is what got me here, and I'm not ready to give that up. How do you address that? It seems like, if I'm feeling that on my very low level, it seems like these athletes or executives or whomever would be feeling it 100 times more than me. What runs through your head with that type of a response from someone?
Yeah. I think about my head's drawn to sort of the 40-year-olds, the 50-year-olds who are burnt out and have a heart attack at work. And at that point they go, shucks, I should have stepped back sooner. That's kind of what kind of comes to mind. It's reinforcing this message of sustainability, isn't it? Again, challenge is really healthy. Healthy challenge is really healthy. That idea of wanting to grow, wanting to develop, but it's doing so in a sustainable way. Now, that doesn't necessarily represent a contradiction to what I said a moment ago, because it's something about the level of striving or the need for striving versus the want for challenge and to develop and grow. So it's the sustainability argument of that. I'm like, yeah, I can see those CEOs who have been super successful, and the way that they've been super successful is continually, striving and pushing forward. And I might encourage them just to sit back and reflect on at what cost, sometimes either to their own physical health, mental health. So that's also not intended as a criticism, okay? Because I think it is about what people value. Okay. And some people value wealth, some people value status, some people value those things. And if that's what people value, then we should encourage people to live in line with their values. And if that's what they value, then great. We might encourage them to think about, where did these values come from, or how did you come to have these values?
And are they still values that, are you carrying them over from a different age? Are you carrying them over from a different, you use wealth, for example. What are you going to do with it? Like, you've got X dollars sitting in the bank. Who cares? Like, how will your life be different? Or I don't know. Is that part of it too, is reflecting on, because a value that's super important in your 20s may not have anything to add in your 50s or your 40s or your 70s or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I exist within the world of academia, which is full of high performers, Absolutely. Full of high achievers, full of people striving to get tenure and professorship and all that sort of thing. And the thing that I've noticed amongst peers, colleagues, mentors, which totally reflects what you're saying, is what happens when they start a family. And all of a sudden, that treadmill, that striving changes, and they go, actually, my values are now different because now I have a young family and I want to spend time, and et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't have to be family; it could be anything. Sure. But I think you're absolutely right to highlight that the values we hold at one point might shift and change as a result of what happens to us in life. I think when you look at a lot of the post-traumatic growth literature, stress-related growth literature, what we see is that at moments when people experience, having a child would not be an adversity. That would be an amazing life opportunity. But the same kind of true is when you have these significant life moments, it encourages people to stop and think about what is important to them. And as you said, that might mean that people shift what they value. And what we would advocate then is living authentically to your values. What is it that's important to you?
And to do that, you've got to spend time reflecting. You use the word stop and think, or stop and reflect. And I get the sense that's the core issue, is we don't. We're so busy on that. If I were to stop and consider, does this matter? my answer might be no, but I didn't stop. I didn't reflect. I just kept going. So is that a big part of your guidance for these coaches, athletes, and others to build that into their coaching methodology where they're spending time, as you said, and I love the way you said that, getting to know the person beyond the athlete, but really having that reflection? Or do you say, we can't have that conversation? We're paying this guy $3 million a year to kick a ball, and we don't really want to know if he doesn't value that anymore.
Yeah. It can also be really uncomfortable to stop and reflect. I think that's so again, when somebody says they haven't got time to do that, why is somebody not making the time to do that? And it might be because they feel like they've got lots of deadlines, but it might also be because it might feel quite uncomfortable to sit and reflect, which is funny when you think about people who strive and who kind of seek challenge, and that in itself can be uncomfortable, but yet that's a discomfort that maybe feel more comfortable with than sitting and looking internally, and that self-awareness. I think within the work that we've been doing, we've been working with sports in recent times. We've been focusing a lot on environments, and we've been trying to shift some of the conversations that people have been having about, for example, mental health, how they understand mental health. Do they subscribe to a medicalized model? Do they believe more of this relational approach, which I've kind of touched on? And that brings a lot of discomfort in the room. And the way that we manage that is by giving time in the training for them to, we try not to pack it with content. We provide content, and we provide time for reflection, time for space, time for discussion, and that reflection might be done with others. That reflection might be done, here's a half-hour break in the day, go for a walk, or go for a swim, or go for a cycle, or whatever it might be that you want to do. So we were very intentional with some of the training that we've developed to build those rest periods, down periods, reflective periods, so that people can kind of process and make sense. Because as soon as you start challenging people's minds, the way people have thought about things, or the way people have understood things, that's really uncomfortable. And that might lead to confrontation. It might lead to shutting down. So you need to allow time for these ideas to percolate almost, and to happen. And whether that's over the course of a couple of days, whether it's over the course of, you deliver the training and you come back a week later and you sort of say, okay, where are you at? A few different bits and pieces that kind of come through with that, but giving time to people as a facilitator, as a coach, giving time for reflection, and also helping people with the skills for reflection, because it's not something that everybody is great at. It's not something we get taught at school. It's not like maths or history or whatever. Like it's, and so how do we teach those skills? And actually, one of the things I work with my students on, my bachelor students, is, and the students kind of cover not just sports psychology, but sports science, kinesiology, and all the different kind of professions, is how do we help them develop self-reflection skills through their bachelor's training, so that they can then utilize them later. They don't thank me for it. Hopefully in 10 years, they might thank me for it.
I love that. And you're making me think. We do I think this is going to be year 7 of the coaching retreat and symposium that we do up in the mountains with coaches from all over the country here in the US. And it's exactly what you're describing, because almost every conference you go to, health and wellness or not, you're just rushing. You're so exhausted when it's over. You're running from course to course or speaker to speaker and breakout to breakout. And we felt like there's got to be something that does what you're talking about, of help these coaches have a chance to reflect, to sit back, to soak in, to journal, to sit on a rock, to go for a walk, etc. So I love the fact that you're saying that's a core element. One of your studies, recent, April 24, about the case for curiosity in sport. My eyes went, Whoa, we got to talk about that. Walk us through that one. What was involved there? What'd you find? Where did we take that, et cetera?
Yeah, it's I smile when because you're not the first person who's asked me a very similar question. They're like, "This sounds great. Where's this come from?" It came from a student. So it was one of my doc students led the work, and at the time he was, he still is, a trainee practitioner, sports side practitioner, and he was working in a school like 17, 18-year-old kids, and also working in a soccer academy, football academy. And he came to me and he said, "Dan, like the way that we work with these kids is so different at college,
between the two different.
Yeah, at college, at school, we're encouraging them to learn. We encourage curiosity. We encourage them to explore. When I go to the football club, do as you're told.
Right.
Do as you're told." So it just really sparked an idea for us. It's like, well, what is this thing? There are lots of constructs in psychology and in sport and in coaching, novelty and all sorts of things might come into it. But we were like, what is curiosity? Why should we be interested in curiosity? And so the article you're referring to is, I guess, our first throw at a ball, if you like, our first kind of like, well, let's just put a bit of a position point. Like, we think this is interesting. We don't know much about curiosity in sport. There's not really any literature on it. There's a little bit in education spaces, which again talks about lots of favorable outcomes. But not so much within sports. So we did that first initial piece of work. And actually, we've got a study ongoing at the moment where we're a qualitative study interviewing coaches, athletes, practitioners who are involved in kind of, I think we call it talent development pathways, or high performance youth pathways, and just trying to understand from their perspective, like, what does curiosity look like in that space from someone who's experiencing, so someone who's trying to create that as a coach, perhaps, from an athlete who might be experiencing and trying to show that curiosity. So that's really fascinating. And I guess the other point that kind of comes to mind is, what about the curiosity of the coach? What about the curiosity of the practitioner? So we're talking about perhaps encouraging curiosity for your athlete. But where's your curiosity as a practitioner as well? What can you do for your own? So really, really early days in that space, but it kind of, as I said, stemmed from this fascination between the difference in education and the difference in sport. And don't get me wrong, there are issues with the education system as well, but it was this kind of real stark contrast which provoked the question.
What would be examples of that? I mean, the one maybe for the coaches is not saying we've always done it this way, so we'll continue to. The coach who is really digging into what is the latest physiology, kinesiology, et cetera, psychology, tell us about the better way to train these young people. But is there a different element of curiosity beyond that? And then what does it look like in an athlete? I think I'm having trouble getting my arms around, okay, so I'm a soccer player, a basketball player, a runner, whatever. How does that play? What does that look like? What would be a couple examples of how that looks?
Yeah. And I think it's important here to be careful not to try to lean too much into creativity. But I think there are links between these two here. So if I'm curious as a player, I want to know more. I want to ask questions. I want to perhaps learn more about myself. I might want to learn more about training techniques. I might want to learn more. So if you're a coach, you're thinking about trying to create a space where they're able to ask questions and things like that. In terms of what type of things that might actually look like, it might be that a coach says, sets up a drill and gives no instructions, or gives very loose instructions and lets the players try to work out what's going on here. What's the skill that the coach is trying to develop? And you're kind of encouraging that kind of problem solving, that kind of thinking, almost the critical thinking on the player's perspective as to, okay, he's created this drill. What is it that he's wanting us to do? What is it that he's wanting us? And you're kind of therefore encouraging creativity through curiosity, through asking questions. So they would be some of the types of examples. I always talk, when I think about an educational setting, I think about saying to my students, like, I want you to be curious about this topic. I want you to go and find your own avenues. I want you to go and find your own rabbit holes that you're going to go down and come back out again. That's what we're trying to create. So within a sporting space, why do we not say the same to our athletes? Why do we not say, okay, you want to be a rugby player, American football player, a basketball player? Show curiosity in your sport. Go and learn about different things that might be relevant for your sport. So giving space to do that.
Purposely building it in, not just saying it's valuable to learn, blah, blah, blah. It's literally part of practice. It's literally come back to practice having done this exercise or this history lesson or whatever. I mean, you actually do hear that in the greats. We mentioned Michael Jordan earlier. He knew everything about every aspect of the NBA, everything. And so you do see that at that level. That is so interesting. Let's talk metrics for a minute. When we talk about health and wellness, are there ways to measure this in performance and how this whole intersection is between performance and health and well-being for coaches that are listening to this saying, ooh, yes, this is valuable, this is important. Dan, how do I measure whether we're doing any better?
Yeah, that's a tricky question to answer in a straightforward way.
Sure.
There is a metric that we use. We kind of break down performance and well-being into three aspects. We see performance as a subjective performance. So how do I feel like I performed? And then from a well-being perspective, we consider two types of, there are many different ways that well-being has been carved up, but we consider hedonic well-being and eudaimonic well-being. So hedonic well-being is about kind of those positive feelings, those positive emotion states, broadly speaking. And eudaimonic well-being is more about how you're functioning and how you're working, I guess, as a person. And so the way that we do it within the academic literature is to use measures for those kind of three things: performance, well-being, and the two types of well-being. That isn't then a straightforward kind of copy and paste to practice. And so it definitely does become more messy and more complex if there are coaches thinking, how do I do this? So I would be more thinking about do away with the metric, and that might be uncomfortable because sport involves a lot of metrics, but do more with the story, do more with the questioning, the experience. So asking players about, how satisfied with, ask them the question rather than measure it. How satisfied with you, how you performed today? How do you think it compared to how you would normally perform? Were you satisfied with that? So kind of having those questions. And then from the wellness, well-being perspective, how are you feeling? How did you feel during that? Did you feel energized? Did you feel frustrated? Did you feel angry? Did you feel? And so I would have it more in that space. I think that's a more user-friendly version, is to almost have kind of prompt questions that you might ask the player, the performer, about how they're feeling. And I mean, there's probably no surprise to that when I've said this is about relationships. So actually, the more communication that you have with your athletes, the better your understanding of your athletes. And then that kind of in itself hopefully fuels more positive outcomes as well. So a long-winded answer, probably because it's not as straightforward, here's the tool, here's the answer, because there isn't one answer. But hopefully that gives some context.
So it's really almost qualitative versus quantitative. If we're using academic language here we've got to sit down and talk to our athletes and ask them these questions versus give them a 5-question assessment that they fill out after practice every day. I know coaches are sitting here going, dude, I don't have time to get them on the practice field, let alone sit down with all 12 of my athletes or 30 of my athletes. What's the practical application of that wonderful sounding advice? But I hear coaches, whether they're health and wellness coaches or athletic coaches, saying, awesome, it ain't happening.
Yeah. And I totally hear you too on that. And I can hear them also saying the same thing ringing in my ears as well. Within our work, we've used both approaches. And we have been able to do quantitative pieces of work using those types of scales, where we've had athletes complete them at the end of every training session for sort of a block of 2-3 weeks, and then training twice a day. So there are approaches, but it's probably that the statistics, or how you would interpret the statistics behind it, would get messy. So that's why I've kind of been hesitant to sort of forefront that. But you could also maybe have three prompt questions. I've responded by saying them qualitatively, but you could of course have the 3 prompt questions in a scale of 0 to 10 or something like that. And you could use that as just a gauge for doing it. So of course you can reduce down. The academic in me, the researcher in me, is like squealing a little bit here, because I'm like, oh, is it reliable and is it valid and all those sorts of things. But there is also, of course, the practical utility that you talk to, and the need to have approaches that are actually going to be feasible in those settings.
What about something like HRV? As we were talking about this, I started thinking, well, I've been using that the last couple of years to track my own, and when I'm getting too much, and the nice thing about HRV, at least in theory, is it's collecting the stress of all of life. It's not just athletic stress. So when I do that little test each morning, it gives me a sense of what's happening: family, work, athletics, sleep, fueling, travel, alcohol intake. You just kind of go down the list, but it gives it to me in one number. And then I can reflect and say, ooh, that's a little lower than it usually is. I wonder what's going on. Would something like that, have you used something like that with coaches where they have their athletes use that? And hey, if you pop into the yellow, the tool that I use is Marco Altini's tool. What is it called? HRV for training. So it pops into the yellow when it's kind of a warning. So maybe a coach could say, hey, kids or athletes, when you pop into the yellow, I'd love to chat with you. Maybe we can review a little bit about what is bubbling to cause that piece. I don't know, anything like that, because that feels like, while not fully objective, is somewhat objective, and it pulls in the various aspects beyond sport.
Yeah. HRV, you mean heart rate variability?
Correct. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to check that. So in terms of kind of heart rate variability and other sort of psychophysiology kind of type markers and tools, we did do a piece of work where we looked at salivary stress hormones and tried to understand if there was an association between, so it was a specific context. It was sort of pre-game or morning of match stress hormones on thriving within the match. And we saw some loose associations, but nothing what as a researcher would call statistically significant. Sure. So nothing that I'm going to sort of pin myself to. The other part of me that kind of from what you're suggesting is, given all of the variety of factors that you described there in terms of sleep, stress, work, sport, and boiling that down into one number, that feels really reductionist. It feels to me like, how can that number truly represent that complexity and that mess of things? I don't mean mess in a negative sense. I mean mess in terms of it's a web.
Absolutely.
Maybe a web's a better word. Like there's these web of factors. How can we truly boil that down into one number? And maybe that's the skeptic in me, sort of with these sort of tracking technologies, and they have been huge advancements. But yeah, part of me is like, I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether you can boil it down to one number. What you did say, which I would agree with, and I think is really helpful, is using a tool to start a bigger conversation.
Yes, I think that's where I was going with this. Is the number tells us nothing, but it tells us something is happening, and then that creates the conversation with the coach to say, Coach, my HIV score was kind of low the last couple of days. Okay, let's talk about this. So it's not giving the answer, it's highlighting the need for an answer, if you will. Is that something you've looked at or considered looking at?
It's not something that we've done, but I can see the value in that. As I said, I can see the value of having, it's like an early warning system, isn't it, really?
Exactly. It's an alarm. We don't know why the alarm's going off, but it means we need to check. Maybe it's just the battery needs replacement.
Yeah. And I can definitely see the value in that, so long as the follow-up part is there.
Yes, not by itself.
And I guess that's sometimes maybe that's actually where my hesitation is coming from in my response, that I maybe fear that, okay, from a coach's perspective or a performance director, whoever, it's like, okay, great, we've got the system in place. We'll just wait until the system says there's something wrong before we do something.
Right.
Whereas I'm coming at it from a more proactive approach of, well, we don't need the system if we focus on creating better environments, if we focus on creating better spaces. So, and there's also, I think, by having that kind of warning system, if you like, that runs the risk of creating panic and crisis, like, oh no, what's happened? There's somebody, they're not where they need to be. And then perhaps that doesn't allow us to upskill the coaches in the skills that they need at that time because they use it so infrequently.
Right.
So there's definitely a hesitance and an anxiety coming from me. And I'm just making sense of that as we're talking. I can see different parts of I guess, my thoughts feeding into it. So I'm making sense of it while we're talking, but yeah.
Yeah, I love it. Mindfulness, mental resilience, where do those pieces fit in the whole optimal performance equation, if you will?
Yeah, so I don't know. I haven't done huge amounts of work, in fact, barely any on mindfulness. So I'm not well placed to talk about that. Although the idea of acceptance that sometimes fits into mindfulness and being present in your current context are definitely themes that I've kind of spoken to. Resilience is something I'm much more familiar with in terms of our research and just more broadly, I guess. I think resilience runs the risk of providing an unhelpful narrative because it kind of emphasizes this sort of fear of vulnerability, this kind of stoic nature, and that you just need to be tougher, you just need to put up, and you just need to deal with.
Right.
And for me, those are really unhelpful messages for helping people work through their difficulties and their challenges. But that being said, like, of course, as we go through life, we need to have some element of resilience to deal with the stresses and the daily stresses that we have. And I guess within some of our writing, we've spoken about how maybe having some resilient qualities allow us to thrive. So if we have, and so things that of resilient qualities that might get identified are things like having robust confidence, having kind of a proactive personality, regular or good access to social support. So things that essentially enable us to maintain our functioning. So if I just step back out and come back in, I guess that when I think about resilience, I think about it as our ability to kind of maintain our functioning in amongst difficulty and challenge and strain. So if we have a set of skills or qualities that allow us to maintain our functioning, then that would allow us to be resilient. If we're already thriving, if we feel like we're performing well and we've got high levels of well-being, then having those resilient qualities will allow us to continue to thrive through difficulty because we're able to draw on those kind of resilient qualities. So, and certainly what we're seeing within the literature is that people, within our research, that people who score highly for resilient qualities are more likely to fall into kind of a thriving category, if you like. So there is absolutely a role to play on some of those characteristics. But I think it's part of a bigger puzzle. And so, again, I think what makes us resilient as people, for me, is not just about what I do on my own, but what I do with the people around me and how those relationships and connections allow me to be resilient. So again, it's not so much about me being tough on my own or me being able to put up on my own. It's about me drawing on my network around me when I need to be resilient and to help and work together as a kind of an integrated kind of set of people at that moment to maintain our functioning. So I see resilience, individual elements, absolutely, but also it's about kind of the social connections that you've got. So that's kind of how I see that feeding into our experiences of thriving, high performance, and well-being, and other bits too.
So you said something that we've never had a guest mention before, and we've talked about, my PhD focused on mental toughness. So we've talked about mental toughness and resilience and grit and all these things a lot. And you said something that I went, ooh, I love that. Let's dig into a little bit more. And what it is you said resilience, and then you connect it to my team of people. And every guest we've had talking about this, it's been about this internal thing, either something coming from the past or experiences you've been through or growing through those things, all great things. And yet you added something new. I'm very curious. Walk us through this a little bit.
Yeah, we're interconnected. We don't exist or move through this world on our own. We don't exist in a silo. Or very few people do.
Sure.
There are obviously exceptions to every rule, but we live in an interconnected society. We have family units, team units, work group units. I think it's a bit of a misperception to think that we do this stuff on our own. We don't do this stuff on our own. We do this stuff with others. So for me, then, those people around us are as important for our own sense of resilience or sense of able to cope with situations. If you think about a demanding or a highly stressful situation that you might have found yourself in, you probably went and spoke to someone about it, and they then helped you. Or even if you didn't speak to them, you probably would have known that you had someone to talk to if you wanted to. And so that's where that kind of social element kind of fits into this. It's knowing that you've got people around you can connect to if you need to and if you want to, but also we move through life connected with everyone, or not connected with everyone in our life. Sure. So you made a point about kind of growing from previous experiences. And I absolutely subscribe to that. And one of the things that you see within the sort of post-traumatic growth literature and adversarial growth literature is that that growth or that positive change that occurs following a negative experience, one of those dimensions is often the relationships that you hold. And you've identified which relationships are valuable, which relationships you can rely on, and which ones are perhaps less reliable in those moments. And so the nature of those relationships changes. So even in those moments where you've had to sort of survive difficulty, and you might initially think that you've done it on your own, you probably haven't. You've probably drawn on and then got stronger relationships as a result of that.
Yeah, no doubt. I love that. All right, I'm watching our clock. Which question do we go with here? What are some future areas of research in this area that, I mean, your heart just starts to explode when you think about the potential there? Get your juices flowing. What are we looking at seeing as you continue to progress this ball down the field?
Yeah, well, I'm going to stay pretty continuous with what I've been saying, to be honest, because a lot of the work that we've done on thriving so far has focused on the individual. So what does that individual need to thrive? What is that? And increasingly what we've started to look at is, hang on, they exist within these connected groups and teams. So what we're now starting to do, and one of the things that really exciting me is thinking about how do groups thrive? How do teams thrive? And what does that actually look like at that level? So we've recently published a conceptual paper where we've started to try to understand what thriving might look like at a group level. So we talk about collective thriving, we talk about team thriving, and common thriving as maybe different versions of a thing. which we want to unpack. We don't know anything really much about it at the moment. There's some work that's been done in kind of the occupational, organizational space, so in business, I guess, those contexts on these constructs, but there's nothing in sport. So that is, the main topic at the moment that we've got our eyes on and wanting to understand more, recognizing that we're part of groups, parts of teams. Groups are omnipresent in human society. So hang on, let's dial up the complexity here, because things get incredibly messy from a research perspective and statistical perspective once you start looking at groups. But also that's the reality. So let's try to do that.
Yeah. Okay. And then everyday individual, the non-elite athlete, what can we learn about our own lives, our own health and performance from these elite athletes? Are there tips that you've seen kind of bubble to the surface that you're seeing over here with the high performance athletes that would apply to any of us that are going through life? And yeah, we'd love greater well-being and performance in whatever we're doing, even if it's not on these big stages.
Yeah, absolutely. Because ultimately elite performers are still people, right? So the things that are important for them probably have some meaning for us. For me, I would encourage you to think about what makes you feel valued, who makes you feel valued. I would encourage you to think about how do you build connections with others. And these aren't just passing connections. These are sort of deep, rich, meaningful connections and relationships with others. And I think if you focus on building those sorts of things, building connection to yourself, building connection to others, then that's how you can sort of take some of these constructs and these ideas on in your own world.
Dan, that's tremendous. What and who makes you feel valued is the one that bubbles. That I love that. Thank you so much. This is really, we're going to keep track of what you're doing. Keep up the great work. So valuable across many industries, not just sport and performance. So thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's been great to be here.
Such an important conversation. Thank you again to Dr. Daniel Brown for joining us today. And thank you for joining us for this episode of the Coaching Lab podcast. We are the #1 coaching podcast for engaging evidence-based health, wellness, and performance insights. And that's you. That's you. You've got so many options. There are a couple of million podcasts out there. And the fact that you're willing to spend part of your week with us, I really appreciate it. We spend a lot of time on these things, and it's nice to know that it's maybe making a difference. If you're a coach looking for best-in-class resources to build your toolbox, support your career, we have a wide and growing range of options available on our Institute site, catalystcoachinginstitute.com, including specialty certifications in both sleep and functional mental toughness. So if that's an interest, if you're trying to build that up a little bit, it might be worth looking into. If you're one of those folks that's thinking, I'm thinking about going toward this coaching certification I hear about as a health and wellness coach, we are very pleased, very honored to mention Fortune Magazine rated Catalyst Coaching Institute the nation's top program. Again, it came out of the blue. We had no idea it was coming, but huge honor. And very, very, very appreciative. Our schedule for the upcoming cohorts is available on that institute site, catalystcoachinginstitute.com. Or reach out anytime. We can talk about your questions, fill in the gaps on things that you're wondering, well, what is this board certification? How does that all work? Should I do that piece? Any of those kinds of things. Just shoot us an email, results@catalystcoachinginstitute.com, and we'll get some time to talk it through. And now, it's time to be a catalyst. This is Dr. Brad Cooper of Catalyst Coaching. I'll speak with you soon on another episode of the Coaching Lab podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.